Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
And let's welcome our speaker tonight, Bob.
It's getting like the rodeo. I'm Bob, I'm an alcoholic. And just because I can, I want to say I also addicted to anything you can do more than once if I like it. So. And if I don't like it, I can learn to like it pretty much. First things first, thanks, Steve, for inviting me to participate in my own recovery in public tonight. I have no idea what I'm going to talk about or why. Our stories disclose in a general way. It's an open meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, isn't it? Which means there are probably some civilians here. I was looking at people that raised their hands, and there were as many people with long-time sobriety raising their hands as there were newcomers. And that's sort of a shift in this meeting. You know, this meeting used to be full of newcomers. There's somebody who couldn't find their phone to turn it off. Maybe it was for me, man. And that's interesting. When our stories disclose in a general way what we were like, what happened, and what it's like now. It doesn't say what it was like. It says what we were like, because the way it was is the same way it is today. It's the same out there, except now with cell phones and computers and, pocket devices of one type or another. But it's the same world, it's the same bars, it's the same substances pretty much. There's some new things. Am I the only one in this room that wonders what Zima tastes like? It just sounds like it should do something that I want to have happen, Like, shine your car up like new polish, that describes what your car polish doesn't. Zima, puts you into a state of Zima. And then you can take it from there if you're able to. Anyway, so what I was like basically was like, give me it, let me use it, let me finish it, let me destroy it, let me wring it out, let me wear it down, let me just get sick of it and then dump it, Except there was never enough of any of those things that I wanted. And my story, is like, it's really an alcoholic story. It's not as interesting to you as yours is, but, you're going to hear part of it anyway. See if you can identify with any of it. I was born at night during a blizzard, and I was raised by wolves. And I ate a fermented persimmon and got drunk and got kissed by a prince, and here I am. None of which is true. Maybe the prince part, I don't know. Anything could happen in a blackout. I'm a blackout drinker, I don't see any reason to be a social drinker. That doesn't interest me at all. The idea of having a glass of Tennessee sipping whiskey and, watching the Raiders get beat again, doesn't interest me. I like to just pour as much flammable liquid down my neck as fast as I can to get to a state of otherworldliness, you know. And I use anything else I can find to try to achieve that state, you know. What happened to me was, you know, pretty normal. Like, I didn't grow up in an alcoholic family. I had no idea what social drinking was supposed to be about. You know, there wasn't any alcohol around my house, you know. Occasionally relatives would come and visit, and they would bring some alcohol, have a few drinks and a few laughs, and they would leave, and they'd, you know, they'd either take the alcohol with them, or, you know, it would sit in the closet for like till that somebody else came by. So I didn't really know what to do when I was 13 years old and went to a friend's house, and his family was having a party, and his father took note of the fact that I had a Chesterfield cigarette in my left hand, and offered me a drink, you know, and I said, thank you very much. And he said, what would you like? And I didn't have a clue. I just didn't have a clue what to ask for. You know, I didn't like the taste of beer. I'd tried a couple of beers, you know, and hanging out with the guys and stuff. I just didn't like alcohol much. And, you know, and this is a long time ago, so they didn't have drugs in grammar school when I was young. You know, they didn't even have television, you know, when I was really young. You think I'm kidding, but I'm not. And, you know, I still remember those wrestling matches, you know, they used to put on. If you think content on television is lame now, man, you should have checked it out when it was new. It was really sorrowful. In any case, so this guy's father asked me if I'd like a drink, and I said, sure. And he said, what are you having? And I became an alcoholic by saying, with keen animal cunning, whatever you're having. And he handed me a vodka and tonic. And I had never tasted quinine water, you know, and it just tasted like bad lemonade or horrible 7-Up or something. And I just drank it right down, you know, and it made me thirsty. So I had another one, you know, and then they were going so fast, I thought, you know, is this drinking, man? You know, how can people get drunk like this? And I had another one, and, you know, and I got that register that we get with whatever substance it is that does a trick for us. You know, some people it's food, some people it's a needle, some people it's a puff on some non-habit-forming herb. So other people, you know, it's like some dust that goes up your nose, you know. Some people it's something that happens under the covers. So, you know, just whatever it is, some people it's a swallow of something potent, you know. And it's the one that hits you. All right now. This is my party, you know. Where's the women? You know. And the next thing I knew, I was getting slapped, and the laughter stopped, and I felt really hideously out of place and embarrassed and shamed, and like everybody was looking at me. They weren't, but, you know, I felt like that. And my reaction to that, you know, was to go to the bar and try to get some more giggle water so I could get that feeling back. And that's my drunkalogue. That's it, basically. It happened at 13, and for 25 years I pursued it. I tried to get that party back, you know. That's all. That's what I wanted out of it. That's what I wanted out of life, you know. I just wanted to keep that party going, you know. I just wanted to find out new things and keep the party going and stay stoned, basically. You know, because my take on it is this, you know, like you hear this old sort of joke about, you know, that sort of like people without a clue tell about recovering alcoholics, and they say, you know, things, you know, television comedians say things like this. They say, well, how does it feel when you get up in the morning and know that that's how you're going to feel all day, you know? And my take on it when I'm using is, well, when you get up in the morning, why wouldn't you have a wake-up of some kind? I mean, let's get this show moving. In fact, I'm the kind of alcoholic and drug addict that likes to take a little something before I pass out at night so that when I wake up in the morning, I'm going full speed, you know? I like a little Spaniel or something, you know, before I crash so that I wake up, you know, 2 or 3 hours later, I'm already going, man. You know what I mean? I'm ready for action. And I don't have to spend too much time doctoring myself into human form. And like I say, there's not enough of any of that for me. There's not enough of anything. There's not enough cherry pie. There's not enough Baskin Robbins. There's not enough of that non-habit forming video poker. There's not enough of that, there's not enough sex. There's not enough, there's just not enough, Hey, by the way, bacon. Now, I'm not supposed to eat bacon, due to some, interesting adventure I had a year or so ago involving some rewiring. But, bacon, it's not a meat, is it? I mean, isn't bacon, it's kind of a candy, or something, I don't think it's American that you can't eat bacon. There's something subversive about that. And yet I digress. Three-dimensional bacon. Like big chunks of bacon roasted over an open fire. Now we're talking. Oh God. So, where was I? Oh yeah, it was like being stoned and running around, and my drinking took me like lots of places, up and down, up the elevator, crashing into the basement, up and around. I would doctor myself into shape, and and I'd go and make something of myself at least in my mind, and then the next thing I would wonder why I was locked behind a door with a needle in my arm or something. And I wouldn't know how that had happened. It just seemed like, I don't know. It just seemed like it just happened. You know what I mean? I never saw that I took any steps in that direction. I never, I don't know about you, but I could rationalize a heart attack. You know what I mean? In fact, I have rationalized a few heart attacks. So it's like, I better not eat egg salad before I go running, That's not good, I better change that little part of my diet. I just never occurred to me that, it wasn't right to get up in the morning and have a drink. It just makes sense to me. Or smoke, or something else. And, I got in trouble with it, of course, like we're not all of us, but like a lot of us do. I got in trouble with the law behind it. I got in trouble with my friends behind it. I got in trouble with a lot of lovers behind it. I got in trouble with a lot of job situations behind it and never missed a day of work. What, me? I'm always there. Because when I'm drinking, using, I'm handsome and bulletproof. And I know what's happening. Excuse me? I am an expert when I'm drinking. I know how to manage the Dodgers into a world championship. I know how to coach the Lakers. I could probably play the violin if I wanted to put in the time, And I'm pretty sure I could learn to do my own income tax, I could run a marathon if it wasn't so hard, But somehow it's just this kind of rationalization, yet I digress. So I was drinking all this alcohol and being stupid, and what happened to me was I was trying to sell some drawings to a lady, and it was making me nervous to show her these drawings, so I offered her a glass of wine, and she said, "No, thank you." And that made me more nervous, so I said, "It's really good wine." And she said, "No, thank you very much." And I said, "What's the problem? Are you an alcoholic?" And she said, "Yes, I am." And she seemed so proud of it, man. I mean, it was just like really depressing, And I said, "Do you go to those meetings where, all the movie producers and people, show business people go?" And she said, "Yes. Would you like to go sometime?" And I said, well, because I'm trying to make a deal here. I said, well, sure, be interesting. And I said, when are you going? And I thought she would say that we go, at the solstice, and we go like on May Day and the 4th of July or something. And she said, in about 20 minutes, I'll drive. And I started to say, I don't think so tonight, and then I realized I'd already told her I was free for dinner. So, and I thought to myself, why would I be afraid to go to an AA meeting, man? I'm from Akron, okay? I know about this prairie gibberish, It's not going to bother me to go to another church supper and eat some baked beans and some bad potato salad and, listen to some accordion music, maybe do a little square dancing or something. I mean, I just didn't have a clue what AA was all about. I had a couple of friends who were going, they thought I might find it interesting. So there's a lot of interesting people in there, good-looking people, funny people. And I thought, sure, I bet there is. If you like to go in the closet with Uncle Ernie, there is, So anyway, I went with her, and, she drove out here. She is a horrible driver, I must say. She's a horrible driver. She brought me to this meeting. And she brought me to this meeting December 15th, 1977. And I walked into this room, and there were about, 30, 40 people here. And we were here at the end of the meeting. She made a perfect 12-step call on me. She got me to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. She got me to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. That's a perfect 12-step call. She brought me in this room. Nobody looked like alcoholics. I said, where are the alcoholics? She said, well, the judge sends a lot of people here. And just then they announced that there would be a regular meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous here in the same room at 8:30. So when she said, are you ready to go to dinner now? I said, no. Let's stay and see what a real meeting is all about. And the real meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous is about this size. And this little 62-year-old man got up there, and he had a little gray pencil mustache and wavy gray hair, and his belt matched his loafers, and he had a little checkered jacket on, looked like a tout from the racetrack. And he got up here and he just started telling lies, started telling lies about being in show business and, stealing crocodiles and putting them in his hotel bathtub and scaring the maid and jumping out of a window trying to commit suicide. And there was a construction site next door and he landed in a pile of sand. And, I was laughing too. And I thought this guy was pretty funny, and I thought, what? He's a great liar, this little weasel, He's obviously a professional AA person. And then he said, I never felt completely dressed unless I had a pocket full of Benzedrine tablets when I left the house. And I thought, how does he know that about me? And I turned to Molly and I started to ask her. And then I realized you weren't actors and you weren't participating in a 300-person intervention. This was an AA meeting. And I identified with this guy. And then he talked about going on for the next 15 years, what it took him to find out if he was an alcoholic or not. And he told my emotional story. After it was over, I went to thank him for making me laugh. He said, are you an alcoholic? I'm a United States government alcoholic. Chief surgeon, Chelsea Naval Base, Boston, Massachusetts, pronounced me unfit to fool around with firearms, and better off not touching high explosives of any kind. So, I'm like, that's great. That's a license to drink more. So I said, yeah, I'm an alcoholic. And he said, do you have any money? And I had a lot of money in my pocket. I'd just been paid off for working on this film. And I made him pay me in cash. And in case I needed to buy something in a hurry, And I didn't trust banks, so I had the money stuffed in my boot. And he said, I don't think we can help you. He said, you're killing yourself, and I don't think we can help you here. I'm going to buy you a bottle or a fix, whatever you want. And I thought, that's a pretty nasty way to approach a newcomer. You know? And he said, but let me tell you, he said, if you can go 24 hours without a drink or a pill or a fix or whatever you're doing to yourself, you're a success, no matter what any son of a bitch has to say about you. And then he turned away. And I bought that. I went home, I thought, well, you know what? I'll go 24 hours and just see if I feel like a success or not. And the next day, before I could make that determination, Cindy B came over to the house, and I've been chasing her all over town for a couple of years, you know. And we'd done a lot of stuff together, but we had, you know, she wouldn't give me none, basically. Because she didn't like guys at the time. And then she got married and had 2 kids, and was I pissed. I took it to personally, you know what I mean? But anyway, she came over and took me to a meeting, and she gave me the 20 questions that we got over here. And she turned the answers under so I couldn't read it. I answered 17 yes, looked at where it says you're definitely an alcoholic, and thought, yeah, but I'm not a real one. You know, I'm not a real one. And that's another part of my story. I'm not a real one. And what that did was it prevented me from actually getting into this program. For about 2.5 years, I stayed sober. It can be done. You can stay sober here. You know, I went to a meeting every day. That's the one thing I did right. You know, like Dr. Paul used to say, I caught alcoholism when I got here. It's a disease you catch through the ear. You know, and I caught it by listening in these rooms. And I heard my story over and over and over again. I just didn't, you know, see the need to take the steps. You know, they just look too hard, for one thing. You know, there's good and bad news about these steps. You know, the bad news is that they're designed to get us to do precisely what we have no intention of ever doing. You know, the good news is if we make a half-hearted attempt to kind of follow these steps, the fear will go away. The paranoia will go away. The hopelessness will go away. You know, that's a great fact. That's my promise to you, you newcomers. You know, and by the way, you know, being a newcomer can be a lot of fun. You know, they say that you newcomers are the lifeblood of this program. You're the most important person in the room. Bullshit. The most important person in the room is me. You know, I wish I could say I came here to save lives tonight. You know, I wish I could say I came here to be a spiritual guru or to get a merit badge or something. I really came here to stay sober tonight. If anybody in this room is going to get drunk tonight or loaded, better all of you should get drunk than me. I'm serious. And if you don't feel that way about your sobriety, get a clue. Because a time will come. One of the advantages of having long-term sobriety is that you get to find out certain hard truths about recovery. The time will come when you can't find a reason to stay sober. You know, when it just doesn't make sense. And you think, what's the use? Why bother? Why would I do this? This is stupid. You know, this Vicodin, you know, makes me feel better than I thought have a right to feel, you know. That broken rib has disappeared, you know, or, you know, whatever else. You know, it comes in 1,000 ways, this disease, 1,000 ways. You know, you could say the wrong thing, there goes your career. You know, check it out. People do it publicly now. But I mean, that happens on all levels of society. You know, take this job and shove it. I mean, everybody thinks that. You know, only alcoholics come right out and say it. You know, I don't need your fucking job. That's right, Steve-O. We don't need you either. History, pal. Pick up your check. You know, and that's a kind of like, that's the way the disease gets us. You know, it gets us because we're looking at that hard body crossing the street, and a drunk driver comes across the center line and wipes us out. You know, it gets us, one way it gets us because we didn't balance our checkbook for 4 years. And suddenly I can't understand why the guy's at the door with a warrant, wants to take the truck back, or whatever. Anyway, and yet I digress. So I got sober, and it wasn't fun, okay? It wasn't that much fun to be a newcomer. And I thought to myself, if it doesn't get better, I'm going to get loaded on my first anniversary. On my first anniversary, I was so into staying sober, though, that I didn't tell anybody that I was celebrating 1 year of sobriety, because I was afraid some hard-nosed would say, all right, you said you were going to get loaded, now let's go. And at about 2.5 years of sobriety, I was getting pretty suicidal. I was still living in my luxury apartment on Sal Mineo Memorial Alley in West Hollywood, looking at the water-stained ceiling and trying to borrow the rent, and because all the money went away. God is great in my life, what I choose to call God. I want to talk about that for just a second, I call it God. You call it higher power, God consciousness, karma, Tao, ring, ding, whatever. And I'm not, Namyo Horenge Kyo. But I like to say God because it gets the argument started. Because if you're going to tell me there's no God, you got to explain what there isn't any of to me. And once you get into that, I got you. Sometimes they call this program American Zen, because it's just so simple, There's nobody too stupid to make this program. There's a lot of people who have been too smart to make it, It's just so simple. You can't help but follow this program if you just watch anybody else staying sober. And I'm going to explain that real quick. I believe there's 2 ways of looking at these steps. There's the paramedic way that I wish somebody had told me about when I was a newcomer, so I hadn't stayed afraid of them for 2.5 years. Because at 2.5 years, I in fact did write an inventory. I in fact did take a 5th step. And in fact, I took the 3rd step while writing my inventory. But I heard this, a few years later. If you ever wanted to give it up, and commit suicide or go to sleep for 6 months and wake up with a different personality because what drugs and alcohol had done to your life, you've taken the 1st step. You've admitted you were powerless over alcohol, that your life was unmanageable. And if you ever thought, maybe I won't blow my brains out, maybe I'll stick around and see, what's going on, and maybe I'll get lucky, and maybe I'll win the lottery, Maybe they'll give me my job back. Maybe she'll let me back in the door, whatever. That's the 2nd step. You've come to believe that, something other than yourself might have the answer for you.
Sorry to interrupt your viewing. Taper Dave here. Just wanted to take a second to ask you to like and subscribe to my channel. Let me know if you like what you're listening. I've got some very good talks here, and this one's a great one. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Tell me what you think.
If you've ever come back to your 2nd meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous without having your arm twisted for any reason, or having, by nudge from the judge, or having court cards signed, or, you've taken the 3rd step in a paramedic emergency way. You've turned your life over to the care of whatever is going on in these rooms. Now ask yourself, I don't know how many people were in this room tonight, maybe 200-300, but ask yourself on Thursday night, springtime in Southern California, why it would be this quiet in this room listening to a stark, raving, mad person talk, And imagine this room full of people that were liquored up, let alone armed. There probably are some armed people here tonight, but, and hopefully there's some drunk people here tonight, because where else would you find a drunk? A meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And then when it gets to the 4th step, which looks like a fearless and searching moral inventory, basically that's kind of a glorified shit list. you know? And everybody that's a true alcoholic has got one of those. You got to have some resentments. It's part of the qualifications for joining this outfit. You know what I mean? And you got to have some failure. In fact, you got to fail at everything. You know? That's the qualification for getting in this outfit. You know, you don't have to look good in here. You know? Everybody knows. Everybody knows why you're here. Because you can't, you can't do it. You can't, chemicals aren't doing it, you know? And there's nothing in the literature that says you can't go hire a wino to listen to that for the fifth step. It says share it with another human being. It doesn't say, in fact, it very explicitly talks about, we suggest you do it with a clergyman or a trusted person or somebody knows what you're talking about, but sometimes it's better to do it with strangers. There you have it. That's an emergency way of getting into this program. Now make no mistake, I heartily suggest that you get a sponsor who can explain in detail what this is supposed to be. Basically, it's to lead you to a God consciousness. There I've said it. Must talk about sex and God from the podium. Sex, good. God, even greater. And this program is designed to give us a God consciousness. That's my belief. That's my opinion. It's done it for me, that's enough of qualification. And thanks, Steve, again for letting me come over and participate. We'll take some questions. Addicts to the courtyard, please. Smoke them if you got them, boys. Hi.
How do you let go of resentments with financial parent?
The question is, how do you let go of resentments in the financial area? People that owe you money? Are they alcoholics? If they're sober alcoholics, they'll pay it back. If they're not sober alcoholics, well, let me put it this way. Worry seems to be praying for what you don't want. So if you worry about it, you're just going to, my sponsor used to say to me, does it make you feel good to think about that, Bobby? I say, no, it doesn't. He'd go, well, then don't think about it, Any other questions? Hi.
You talked about God consciousness. What's your experience with the 11th step?
My experience with the 11th step? Sought through prayer and meditation to increase our conscious contact with God as we understand Him. Well, first of all, I pray all the time. I'm one of those people who I believe in visualization as prayer. That's like leads right into worry is praying for what you don't want. I don't know why I'm so serious tonight. Usually I'm clowning here, but maybe I went running and I didn't eat yet, so. And I was watching this parkour stuff on YouTube today. Anybody know about parkour? And I thought, I should learn to do that. Okay, if we can find the rock of time, and take about 45 years away, maybe I would. Just a second, I hadn't finished this question. Yet I digress. So here's an example. Think of a loved one in your life. Somebody that you really love, like a child or a parent or, a lover or an animal that you have unconditional love for. Sometimes it seems like a clue to unconditional love is like the way we feel towards a pet, like a helpless pet, a dependent pet or something. But oftentimes it's a child or somebody that you truly love and somebody that you really want the best for. Maybe it's somebody that in your life that's ill and you want them to get well. really, really badly. I suggest that you imagine them smiling, and happy and healthy and enjoying themselves, And I believe that's the strongest prayer there is. I just really do. I believe, that it's a prayer for us to talk about the idiocy afoot in society. I believe that that's a prayer for sanity and a prayer for clarity and a prayer for change. I think that prayer is thought. I think that thought is energy. And I think, that it's all tied up. In fact, you can really get high school, science about it and go right into energy as calories, and calories are cheeseburgers, and cheeseburgers are candlelight, and you can even get really acidy about it. But I really believe it. I believe all that stuff. I believe in God consciousness, and I believe in the universality of this energy, that can either be created or destroyed. That's a little high school science there, and matter just changing form. And so for prayer and meditation, I pray all day long. There's no, it doesn't have to be, I don't do formal prayers, most of the time. I get up in the morning and I trick my mind by saying thank you. I don't even say thank you, God, or, anything else. I just say thank you. I trick my mind into a positive mode. If I don't do that, or get up and go running right away, or something else, I actually get up and go to Tai Chi now instead of running first thing in the morning. And if I don't do that, I start thinking of the 40 bastards that are out to get me, whether they exist or not. And then for meditation, like I said, do Tai Chi, and I'm not a formal meditator. I never learned that skill. I feel remiss, and I should, but I just haven't. So I often meditate by just staring into space at the horizon line or something. Sometimes I do that kind of paramedic meditation, like of reading the sports pages, because it's just idiocy. But it takes my mind off, the 40. The bad 40. Yeah.
Yeah, but how did your sickness, your illness last year affect your sobriety? Was there any gratitude? Can you talk about that a little bit?
I don't really like to. But suffice it to say that, the illness was, it ended in an operation, and as a result of it was a very invasive process, and as a result of it, I was prescribed, just a shopping list of painkillers. And, the morphine stopped. The doctor came in the day after the operation, said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Like I've been hit by a truck." He goes, "Good, that's the end of the morphine," and because they knew I was an addict and everything. So then I was in, and I had some Percocet, to get to sleep because I had to be in the hospital for a few days. And Percocet and Ambien, So, but, it didn't make any difference. I didn't care. I was immobilized, and I was moving around, but, it just didn't seem to alter anything, but there was really no way of telling because AA people came to the hospital and everything, and it didn't get me high. Or to me, it didn't seem like it was getting me high. I was probably nuttier than a shithouse butterfly, but I just didn't feel it, I certainly wasn't grooving on it, man. When I got out of the hospital, they tried all kinds of things, and, but then the pain started, and nothing would touch the pain. And they kept giving more and more medication, and I called the doctor, and my back was all cramped and stuff. I said, "Give me a muscle relaxer shot right in the muscle." And he gave me a shot in the shoulder, and I said, "What was that?" He goes, I said, "Was that a muscle relaxer?" He said, "No." I said, "What was it?" He said, I'm not telling you." About 10 days later, he told me it was Demerol, And I mean, it was just ridiculous, and then I tried all these other things, and I was just, finally a fentanyl patch came into play. Now, fentanyl is this shit that people OD on all the time, just from patches, and And you're not supposed to take a shower. You're not supposed to. Hot water releases it, you know. So I had this patch on my shoulder, and I was in the shower, you know. And I thought, this is horrible. And I took it off, and I leaned out of the shower and slapped it on the wall, you know. And I finished the shower, and I got out, and I went to bed, you know. And it just kept getting worse and worse, you know. And about 2 days later, I was in the shower, and I looked down at my foot, and I saw this big flap of skin down there. And I thought, what is that doing down there? And I reached down, and it was the patch. You know, it had fallen off the wall. And I'd stepped on it when I got out of the shower. And I'd been wearing it on my foot for 2 days. And I was like, I mean, it was like a Marx Brothers movie, man. You know, and it was, that's how it affected me, you know. Here's the best part, though. Is I had always had 2 hole cards in my sobriety. You know, as you can tell from my sobriety date, you know, I have almost 30 years of sobriety. And I had 2 hole cards. One was suicide, you know, because I'm a depresso. I'm one of those people. I don't know if I'm a clinical depresso. I'm afraid to go find out. Because if I get diagnosed by some like geniuses, you know, UCLA or St. John's or USC or something, if they say, dude, you need medicine, I'm going to be up against it. Because, you know, I've chosen not to treat things that are wrong with me for the most part with chemicals. I've already been on chemicals. You know, I know my proclivity for chemicals. And I know that if you can do it more than once, you know, I'm hooked up for life. So I do everything else I can to combat these dark places. You know, I run, you know, I do Tai Chi, I go scuba diving, I do all these things. And I try to laugh a lot, you know, and I go to a lot of meetings. You know, meetings always make me laugh. And I'm not going to commit suicide because I don't have the nerve. You know, somebody said that a week or so ago here. Said, you know, I would never commit suicide, you know. And neither would I, you know, unless I could jump out of a basement window or something. And I always had a little caveat on that, like a little appendix, you know. Or, you know, made a hot shot for myself. Took a nice overdose. You know, not one of those kind where you try to swallow a bottle of Secanols and throw up and they find you, you know. I don't want to deal with that, but I thought maybe I could find somebody, probably in AA, one of these meetings, you know, to sell me enough smack to do it, you know. And then I also thought, like, if everything got catastrophic, I would enjoy that opiate feeling one more time, you know. I wouldn't be that brave dude who said, no, I'll do it on aspirin. I'll say, yeah, I need it, give it to me, and let me groove. Just turn the television to the Home Shopping Network or something and leave me alone, you know. And the great thing that happened was that I hated, absolutely hated narcotics. I hated them. I hated them. I mean, the idea of having to take narcotics just is horrible to me. You know, and that was like you know, the book says we will change our way of thinking 180 degrees. If you're an alcoholic of my type, you think, yeah, in most areas I will. But there are certain things I will not change 180 degrees. Let's not kid ourselves here. And that was one area where I couldn't believe that it had just completely flipped over. Another one was, you know, when I was a newcomer in this program, I wanted a lot of sobriety. It never occurred to me, you know, that I was going to get old doing that. It just never occurred to me, you know. Let's see, the actors are laughing, you know. I just didn't think that was part of the deal, you know. And when I got to this program, getting old was like one of the most horrible fears that I had going, you know. 30 years later, and I'm embracing it. I'm going, yeah. You know, revenge, man. You know, now I'm rewired. There might be another 30 years of this baloney. Bring it on. Who else? Don't make me talk more. Hey.
Did your concept of God or higher power or God consciousness change over the course of your sobriety? And if so, how?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what has my concept of God changed over the course of my sobriety. Absolutely. And you know what? I speak at meetings a lot because I'm the kind of guy who made deals with God when I was new. I actually bargained with God. You know, it was a hideously unspiritual thing to do, supposedly. But for me, it was one of the most spiritual acts, some of the most spiritual acts I ever engaged in. My deal with God were like things like this. All right, if you exist, let's see you stop me from taking these Percodans. Because I was in so much pain and agony and I hadn't been to sleep in about 3 or 4 days when I was in withdrawal. Because I did it on the street. I didn't go to rehab. And it got so bad and it was so cramped and I was like so tense and so insane between not drinking that I had these Percodans, and I thought, you know, I've never felt this excruciating pain except when I had tetanus once. And so I said to God, if you really exist, because God and I were not on speaking terms when I got to this program. I'm not a religionist to this day, but we weren't on speaking terms. And I grew up around it. I grew up around God consciousness. And I fell asleep before I could take those pills. And I told a guy about it at a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And he said, Frank the junkie, he said, where's the Percodans? Did you take them? And I said, no, I didn't take them. He said, well, if you weren't stupid, you could consider your prayer was answered. You know, because I said, God, if you exist, stop me from taking these pills. And then I sweetened the deal, by the way. I'm not an idiot. I don't box with God. I said, okay, you know, make it 1,000 times worse than this. Well, let's see you stop me from taking these pills. You know, God, you know, is a man of honor. You know, when you live outside the law, you got to be honest, right? So my other deal with God was I'll do anything that AA ever asks me to do, but you've got to feed and clothe me and work me because I don't know how to take care of myself on the square. I just don't know how to do it. I never learned, and I don't know how to do it. And I've never missed a meal or a place to live, place to sleep, you know, clean clothes, unless I chose to do that, you know, from the beginning of my sobriety. I'm one of those sickening people that stayed sober from their very first meeting of sobriety because it was impressed upon me that it was one day at a time. Anybody could do that. One day at a time for the rest of my natural life. You know, not every 29 days, you know, not every 5 months and 29 days, not every 2.5 years, but, you know, forever. And I bought that. And I bought that as a challenge. And I bought that, you know, in fact, Cindy, who came and took me to my second meeting, you know, cruised me once, stopped at my belt buckle and said, if you get loaded, you know what you're going to do. And she said, if you stay sober, you don't have a clue what's going to happen. And then she looked at me witheringly and said, and I thought you were an adventurer. You know, and I bought the adventure, because why not? I'm not here to do time. If this isn't fun, I'm gone. You know, it's painful sometimes, but, you know, it's fun, big time fun. They say it's a song, and the words are in the big book, and the music is laughter in these rooms. You know, and when I was like, you know, a little kid, you know, I had that sort of primal kind of concept of God as some cranky old man with a beard and something, you know, shaking a rod and, you know, touch yourself in the shower one more time. And, you know. And, you know, I mean, there's people, you know, to this day, you know, adults running around the planet who believe in all that stuff, you know. I can't go there because, you know, I'm evolved. But you know, I mean, you know, if whatever gets you through the night, as they say, but you know, not in a liberal, humanistic way, of course, but whatever works for you. You know, my concept of God has changed into that which I told you about before. I'll do a real quick one. You know, one time I said to my sponsor, "I love you," and he said, "You don't know what love is." And he said, I want you to love everybody in these rooms. And I said, I don't like these people, man. He said, I didn't ask you to like them, I asked you to love them. And I said, how could I do that? And he said, you see, you don't know what love is. He said, how many of these people do you want to see die from drugs and alcohol? And I said, nobody. And he said, maybe that means you don't mean them any harm. Why don't you take that home and think about that as a meaning of love? And I did. I thought about that. And the next day I saw God is love in a church window. And I thought, man, you know, could not wanting to see my brothers and sisters die from drugs and alcohol, you know, could that be love? You know, and I know that's kind of, you know, primal too, you know, kindergarten level theology. But, you know, that's what I meant to say, theology, yet I digress. And what it enabled me to do is to read the AA literature, and every time it mentioned God, it enabled me to insert the concept that I don't want to see anybody die from drugs and alcohol anymore. And now I'm willing to do whatever it takes to enable that. I've worked in recovery. I know the recidivism rate around here. It's horrible. You know, if you want to drink and use, man, you know, go ahead, please. You know, because if you haven't had enough, and you don't want this more than you want to drink and use, it ain't going to happen. You know, if you want to stay sober, come to see me as a sober member of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. We'll see if we can fix you up. You know, that's just the way it is. And in another sister program, you know, we say many of us die so that a few of us may live. You know, it's a little harsher program, but because it comes from prison a lot. But, you know, it's the truth. They also say work the steps or die, you know, and that's I have that opinion as well. But meanwhile, I've learned to love everybody in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Isn't that great? Lucky me. Thanks for listening.
I think we got a great talk going on here. Thanks for watching the channel. Taper Dave here. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with. And it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone, through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control's connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs. Long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst, then one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. out, in, oop, out, in, up, down, and then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. I don't know if that shows up. The gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right. But I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.